We welcome you to our story. In an intense and thought-provoking incident, a police officer draws his firearm on a black lieutenant, suspecting her of stealing a police car. This gripping encounter unfolds in a way that raises questions about race, authority, and the assumptions made in high-pressure situations. The situation quickly escalates as the officer confronts the lieutenant, who is in full uniform, with her credentials clearly visible. Tensions rise as the officer's suspicions lead to a charged confrontation, putting both individuals in a precarious position. In this video, viewers will witness the unfolding of a dramatic scenario that highlights the complexities of policing and racial profiling. Throughout the video, the dynamics between the officer and the lieutenant shift, revealing the underlying biases and assumptions that can influence split-second decisions. Please enjoy the story.
It was her first day at this new assignment, and while she was no stranger to challenges, she couldn't shake off a lingering feeling of unease. She had worked tirelessly to earn this promotion, and it hadn't come without its sacrifices. Being a black woman in law enforcement, she knew she would face scrutiny, skepticism, and perhaps even hostility, but Rachel was ready. She had faced prejudice before and had always risen above it. The morning sun reflected off the polished buildings, casting long shadows on the road as she drove. Rachel's mind drifted back to her previous precinct, where she had built a reputation as a tough but fair officer, one who didn't back down from doing what was right, even when it wasn't popular. She thought about her former colleagues, some of whom had become like family. She wondered how things would be different in this new environment. She'd heard stories about the tension within the department, the quiet whispers about not fitting in or shaking things up too much. But she had dealt with worse. As she neared the precinct, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The streets became cleaner, the cars more expensive, and the people walking on the sidewalks were dressed in fine clothes. She noticed the cautious glances from pedestrians, some quick, others lingering longer than necessary. She could almost hear their thoughts. What is she doing here? She had encountered these looks before, and they never failed to leave a sour taste in her mouth. Even with her uniform on, people judged her based on the color of her skin. Rachel shook off the uncomfortable feeling and turned her focus back to the road. The precinct came into view, a modern, state-of-the-art facility that stood out against the backdrop of elegant homes. She pulled into the parking lot, where a few squad cars were already parked. As she parked her vehicle, she noticed several white officers standing nearby, chatting among themselves. Their conversation seemed to stop as she pulled in, and she could feel their eyes on her. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself. "You've earned this, Rachel. You belong here just as much as anyone else." She stepped out of her car, smoothing out the creases in her uniform. She could feel the weight of their stares, but chose to ignore it. She was here to do her job, and she wouldn't let anyone intimidate her. She began walking toward the entrance, her head held high, radiating confidence. But as she got closer, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. "Didn't know we were getting a new lieutenant," one of them said, his voice laced with a hint of sarcasm. "Yeah, and certainly not her," another added with a slight chuckle, as if to make a point. Rachel's jaw tightened. She'd heard it all before, the subtle remarks, the quiet laughs, the unspoken but all too familiar sentiment that she didn't belong. She pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside the precinct. The interior was sleek, with polished floors, bright lights, and a high-tech reception area. It was an impressive facility, no doubt about it. She approached the front desk, where a young officer looked up from his computer. "Lieutenant Rachel Thomas," she said, her voice firm and professional. "I'm here to see Captain Williams." The officer nodded, but hesitated for a moment, as if sizing her up. "I'll let him know you're here, Lieutenant," he said finally, picking up the phone. As she waited, Rachel glanced around the room. She saw a few more officers in the lobby, some glancing in her direction, and then quickly looking away. She could feel it. The unease, the judgment, the quiet resistance. She knew she would have to prove herself all over again, not just as a capable officer, but as someone who could lead, who could be respected despite the color of her skin. She had done it before, and she could do it again. "Lieutenant Thomas," a voice called out. She turned to see Captain Williams approaching, a tall, middle-aged man with a stern expression. He extended a hand as he got closer. "Welcome to the precinct, Lieutenant. I trust your drive was pleasant," he said, his tone courteous but reserved. Rachel shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Captain. Yes, the drive was fine." Williams nodded, glancing around the room for a moment. "Let's head to my office. We have a lot to discuss," he said, gesturing for her to follow. As they walked through the precinct, Rachel noticed the way some officers stiffened at her presence, their eyes following her as she passed. She could sense the tension building, like a thick cloud hanging in the air. They reached the captain's office, and Williams closed the door behind them. "I'll be honest with you, Lieutenant Thomas," he began, taking a seat behind his desk. "There's been some concern from the team about having a new lieutenant, especially one with a reputation like yours." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "A reputation for getting the job done?" she asked, a slight edge to her voice. Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I've heard you're not afraid to challenge the status quo, to stand up against corruption. That's commendable. But not everyone here sees it that way. There's a certain culture in this precinct. It's not perfect, but it works. And some of the officers are worried I might disrupt that." Rachel finished for him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Williams hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Exactly. I'm not saying it's right, but I want you to be prepared for some pushback. You're going to have to earn their trust." Rachel met his gaze steadily. "I've never shied away from a challenge, Captain. I'm here to do my job and do it well. I've dealt with resistance before, and I'll deal with it again if I have to." The captain studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. I hope you mean that. Now, let's go over what I expect from you and what your first few weeks will look like." They spent the next hour discussing her role, the current cases the precinct was handling, and the protocols she needed to be aware of. Despite the initial tension, Rachel found herself somewhat optimistic. If she could just get past the initial skepticism, she could prove herself, like she always had. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. As the meeting wrapped up, Williams walked her back to the main area. "You'll be working closely with Sergeant Davis. He'll show you around and get you up to speed," he said. Rachel nodded and headed over to meet Sergeant Davis, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor. They exchanged brief introductions, and Davis began to show her around the precinct, explaining the layout, introducing her to key personnel, and filling her in on the day-to-day operations. However, as they walked through the precinct, Rachel noticed a young officer standing by the parking lot entrance, watching her closely. His expression was unreadable, but his body language suggested tension. She caught his name tag, Officer Jack Carter. Something about his demeanor put her on edge. She could see the suspicion in his eyes, a skepticism that wasn't just about her being new. She'd seen it before, and she knew what it meant. She decided to keep an eye on him. As Davis wrapped up the tour, he mentioned, "You might get some friction from some of the guys, especially the ones set in their ways. Just a heads up." Rachel nodded, appreciating the warning. "I'm used to friction, Sergeant. Thanks for the heads up." She decided to head back to her car to grab a few more things before settling in for the day. As she stepped outside, she noticed Officer Carter still loitering near the entrance. His gaze locked onto her. She tried to ignore it, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was about to happen, and she was right. The tension was building, and soon it would reach a boiling point. Rachel Thomas felt the weight of the new precinct pressing down on her as she stepped back outside. The crisp morning air was supposed to feel refreshing, but instead it carried a hint of tension. She headed toward her unmarked police car to grab a few more items she had left inside. She had just begun to relax her guard when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Officer Jack Carter walking toward her, a stern, almost predatory look in his eyes. "Hey you," he called out, his voice sharp, like a drill sergeant barking orders. Rachel turned slowly to face him, keeping her expression neutral but alert. "Yes, Officer Carter," she replied calmly, though her senses were on high alert. Carter stopped a few feet away from her, his stance wide and authoritative. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, as if she didn't belong. His hand rested near his utility belt, fingers tapping rhythmically against his sidearm. It wasn't drawn, but the implication was clear. Rachel kept her tone steady. "I'm getting some things from my car," she said, gesturing toward the vehicle. "Is there a problem?" He narrowed his eyes at her, clearly not satisfied with her response. "You got some ID on you?" he asked, ignoring the fact that she was clearly in uniform. His tone wasn't just cautious, it was condescending, dripping with suspicion. Rachel took a slow breath. She knew this type. She had dealt with men like him before, officers who saw her as a threat simply because of her race and her rank. "I'm Lieutenant Rachel Thomas," she said, reaching for her badge. She held it up for him to see, her expression remaining composed. "Just transferred here. I'm sure you've been informed." Carter took a step closer, peering at the badge as if he expected to see something fraudulent. His eyes flicked between her face and the badge, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This looks real nice, but I don't know you, and I don't trust what I don't know," he said, his voice tinged with a barely concealed edge. Rachel felt the tension mounting. She knew she had to be careful with her words. "If you have any doubts, officer, you're welcome to call Captain Williams. He'll verify my identity," she said, keeping her tone professional. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she wasn't going to back down either. Carter stared at her for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing with every second. Instead of acknowledging her suggestion, he tilted his head and smirked. "You know, there's been a lot of reports lately about stolen cars in this area. You driving an unmarked vehicle like this kinda looks like it fits that description." Rachel's heart rate quickened, but outwardly she remained calm. She knew where this was heading. "This is my assigned vehicle, Officer Carter, and I'd appreciate it if you treat me with the respect my position deserves," she replied, her voice firm. But Carter wasn't backing down. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car," he said, his hand now resting more firmly on his holstered gun. The other officers in the parking lot started to notice the growing tension and began to look over. A few of them exchanged curious glances, but no one intervened. Rachel's mind raced. She had just arrived at this precinct, and the last thing she wanted was a confrontation that would put her at odds with her new colleagues. But she also knew she couldn't show weakness in the face of blatant discrimination. "Is there a specific reason you're asking me to step out of my car?" she asked, her voice remaining even, though her eyes were locked onto his. Carter's smirk faded, replaced by a hard, cold stare. "You're not complying with a direct order, Lieutenant. I suggest you do as I say," he replied, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. Rachel's instincts screamed at her to stay calm, to defuse the situation, but she could see the unyielding hostility in his eyes. "Officer Carter, I've given you my ID. I've identified myself as a lieutenant in this precinct. You have no grounds to detain me," she said firmly. Carter's patience seemed to snap. "You think just because you're wearing that badge, you're above the law?" he spat, his voice rising. "Step out of the vehicle now." A small crowd had started to gather, both civilians and other officers. Rachel noticed their eyes on her, some filled with concern, others with anticipation. She knew she needed to be careful. One wrong move could lead to a situation spiraling out of control. She took a breath, considering her options. "I'm not stepping out without a valid reason," she replied, her tone still measured but leaving no room for doubt. Carter's face twisted with anger. "I said, step out of the car," he shouted, his hand moving to unfasten the strap on his holster. The threat was clear now. He was ready to draw his weapon. The crowd around them gasped, and Rachel could see phones being raised, cameras rolling. "Listen, Officer Carter, let's not do this," Rachel tried to reason with him, her hands slowly raising to show she wasn't a threat. "I'm not resisting, but I'm also not going to comply with an unlawful order. Call Captain Williams, he'll clear this up." But Carter wasn't listening, his face flushed with a mix of anger and fear. "Hands where I can see them," he yelled, his hand now gripping the handle of his gun. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her veins, but she knew she had to keep her composure. She couldn't afford to lose control. "My hands are up, officer. I'm not a threat. Let's de-escalate this," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Shut up and get out of the car, now," Carter screamed, his hand starting to pull the gun from its holster. Rachel knew she had to act fast. She raised her voice, speaking loudly and clearly so everyone around could hear. "This is Lieutenant Rachel Thomas of this precinct. I'm being unlawfully detained by an officer who refuses to verify my identity. I'm requesting immediate intervention from a superior officer." The tension was palpable. Some officers in the crowd began to murmur, realizing that things had gone too far. One of them, a sergeant, quickly pulled out his radio, calling for Captain Williams to come to the scene. Rachel kept her eyes on Carter, who was visibly shaking now, his anger mixing with confusion and fear as he saw his colleagues' reactions. His authority was being challenged, and he wasn't sure how to regain control. "Put the gun down, Carter," one of the other officers called out, stepping forward cautiously. "She's a lieutenant. Let's not make this worse." But Carter wasn't ready to back down. "You all think she's one of us? You think she belongs here?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "She's a danger. She could be lying. Could be anyone." "Put it down, Carter," the officer repeated more firmly. Rachel felt her pulse thundering in her ears. She knew this was a critical moment. One wrong move, and he might pull the trigger. She kept her voice calm, steady. "Officer Carter, this is your last chance to step back and de-escalate. I'm not your enemy, but you're making a big mistake." Just as it seemed Carter was about to make a rash decision, Captain Williams arrived, his face a mix of shock and fury. "What the hell is going on here?" he barked, looking between Rachel and Carter. Carter's eyes darted to the captain, his grip on the gun loosening slightly. "Captain, she's your new lieutenant, Carter. Put that goddamn gun away," Williams thundered, his voice echoing through the parking lot. Carter froze, his face going pale as the realization set in. Slowly, reluctantly, he reholstered his weapon, his hands shaking. The crowd exhaled a collective sigh of relief, and Rachel finally allowed herself to breathe. But the damage was done. The phones were still recording, and the crowd was buzzing with energy. Rachel knew this wasn't over. She met Captain Williams' eyes, her own filled with a burning intensity. "We need to talk, Captain," she said, her voice steady, but brimming with a mix of anger and determination. "This is unacceptable, and it's not going away quietly." Williams nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "Let's handle this inside," he said, motioning for her to follow him. "We've got a lot to discuss." Rachel followed him back inside the precinct, but she knew that this was just the beginning. She would not let this go. She couldn't. This wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was ready to fight. Back inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Captain Williams led Rachel Thomas down a long corridor, his face set in a hard line. Rachel could feel the eyes of her new colleagues on her as they passed. whispers rippling through the room like an electric current. The news of the confrontation in the parking lot was already spreading, and it was clear that everyone had an opinion. Some were shocked, others seemed quietly pleased, but most wore expressions of uncertainty and discomfort. Rachel's mind was still reeling from what had just happened. She had experienced her share of hostility in her career, but having a gun drawn on her by a fellow officer at her own precinct was a new low. She felt a storm brewing inside her, anger, frustration, a sense of deep betrayal, but she knew she had to stay focused. She couldn't let her emotions get the best of her, not now. They reached the captain's office, and Williams opened the door, gesturing for Rachel to enter. She stepped inside, taking a seat in front of his desk. Williams closed the door firmly behind them and took a deep breath before sitting down. "Lieutenant Thomas, I want to start by saying that what just happened out there is completely unacceptable," he began, his voice measured but stern. "I apologize on behalf of this precinct. Officer Carter's behavior was out of line, and we will be addressing it." Rachel nodded, but her expression remained tense. "Captain, with all due respect, out of line doesn't even begin to cover it. He drew a weapon on me, in front of civilians and other officers, and he did it because he refused to believe I belong here." Williams sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I understand your frustration, Lieutenant. Believe me, I do. But you have to understand that there's a culture here that... A culture of what? Racism, paranoia, lack of professionalism." Rachel interrupted, her eyes blazing. "Because that's what it looked like to me. And that's what it's going to look like to everyone who sees the video footage that's already circulating online." Williams winced slightly. "Look, Thomas, I'm not here to defend Carter's actions. But I need you to understand that he's not the only one. There's a lot of tension in this precinct. People are on edge, especially with everything that's been going on lately." "And that justifies threatening a fellow officer?" Rachel shot back. "You've got people here who are so blinded by their biases that they're willing to escalate a situation to the point of violence without a second thought. That's not tension, Captain. That's a problem." Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from frustration to resignation. "You're right," he admitted after a moment. "It is a problem. But it's a problem that's not going to be solved overnight. We need to handle this carefully." Rachel crossed her arms, leaning forward slightly. "I want an immediate investigation into Carter's conduct, and I want it to be transparent. If this is how he treats a superior officer, I can't imagine how he's treating civilians." The captain nodded slowly. "An investigation will be conducted. I'll see to it myself. But, Lieutenant, I need you to understand that pushing too hard too fast could create more resistance. If you want to make changes here, you're going to need to play it smart." Rachel's eyes narrowed. She knew he was right, but it didn't make the situation any less infuriating. "I'm not here to play games, Captain. I'm here to do my job and make sure this precinct is up to the standards the public expects from us." Williams held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. "I respect that. I'll do what I can to support you, but you're going to have to earn the trust of the team. Today's incident isn't going to help with that." Rachel felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She knew she was walking into hostile territory, but she hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly. "I'm not here to win a popularity contest, Captain. I'm here to lead." There was a knock on the door, and Sergeant Davis stepped in, his face a mixture of concern and urgency. "Captain, Lieutenant, you both need to see this," he said, holding up his phone. "The video from the parking lot is already going viral. News outlets are picking it up." William's face tightened, and Rachel felt a surge of both dread and vindication. She stood up, taking the phone from Davis and watching the shaky footage of Officer Carter drawing his gun on her, shouting at her to get out of the car. The audio was clear enough to capture the fear and disbelief in the voices of the onlookers, and Rachel's own calm but firm responses. The video ended with Captain Williams arriving on the scene, ordering Carter to stand down. "This is exactly what I was talking about," Rachel said, handing the phone back to Davis. "This isn't just a precinct issue anymore. It's a public issue." Williams rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "All right, here's what we're going to do. Davis, I want a statement prepared for the press. We need to get ahead of this. Make it clear that we're taking this incident seriously and that an internal investigation is underway." Rachel nodded, but she wasn't satisfied. "And what about Carter? What's happening with him right now?" Davis glanced at Williams before responding. "He's been pulled off duty for the time being. He's in the locker room cooling off." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Cooling off? That's it." Williams held up a hand. "Lieutenant, I know you're angry, but we have to follow protocol. We can't just throw him under the bus without due process. I promise you there will be consequences." Rachel took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She knew there was a right way to handle this, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. "Fine, but I want to be kept in the loop, every step of the way." "Agreed," Williams said, standing up. "Now, let's get back out there and show the team that we're all on the same side here. We don't need any more division." As they left the office, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. She glanced around at the faces of her new colleagues. Some looked sympathetic, others wary, and a few openly hostile. She would have to tread carefully, but she was determined to see this through. Rachel made her way to the locker room. She needed to confront Carter directly, not just for herself, but for the message it would send to everyone else. She pushed open the door and found him sitting on a bench, his head in his hands. When he looked up and saw her, his eyes hardened. "What do you want?" he spat, his voice thick with resentment. Rachel took a deep breath. "We need to talk, Officer Carter. What you did out there was not just unprofessional. It was dangerous." Carter stood up, his posture tense. "You think you can just walk in here and start throwing your weight around because you're wearing that badge? You don't know anything about this place, about us." Rachel didn't flinch. "I know enough to see that you've got a problem with authority that doesn't look like you, and that's a problem for everyone here," he scoffed, crossing his arms. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy. You come in here thinking you're better than us, and I'm the one with the problem?" Rachel held his gaze. "I don't think I'm better than anyone, Carter. But I do expect professionalism, respect, and basic human decency. What you did out there wasn't just about me. It was about your own fears and biases. And if you can't see that, then you're not fit to wear that uniform." Carter's face flushed with anger. "You don't get to talk to me like that." Rachel took a step closer, her voice low but firm. "I'm your superior officer, and I will talk to you however I need to if it means keeping this precinct in line. You don't have to like me, but you will respect my authority. Do you understand?" For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. His fists clenched and his jaw tightened. But then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders sagged. He was beaten, and he knew it. "Fine," he muttered, looking away. "Whatever." Rachel nodded, satisfied for now. "Good, now go home. We'll see what the investigation turns up." She turned and walked out, feeling the weight of what had just transpired settle over her. She knew this was far from over. She had made an enemy in Carter, and there were undoubtedly others who would side with him. But she also knew she had allies, those who believed in what was right. As she walked back into the main area of the precinct, she caught sight of Sergeant Davis. He gave her a slight nod of approval, and she felt a small spark of hope. There was still a long road ahead, but Rachel was ready. She had faced bigger challenges, and she had no intention of backing down now. The precinct was watching, the public was watching, and Rachel Thomas was prepared to lead them through the fire. The tension in the precinct was palpable. Every officer seemed to be on edge, eyes darting towards Rachel whenever she passed. It was clear that the lines were being drawn, and the atmosphere was charged with an unspoken electricity. The incident in the parking lot had polarized the precinct, creating a rift that was only growing deeper by the hour. Some officers showed signs of support, a nod here, a reassuring glance there. Others, however, had their own quiet conversations, casting wary looks in Rachel's direction, their loyalty to Carter evident in their body language. Rachel knew the situation was delicate. She had made it clear to Captain Williams that she would not tolerate any form of discrimination or unprofessional behavior. The video of Officer Carter drawing his weapon on her had gone viral, and the pressure was mounting on the precinct to take definitive action. But as she moved through the precinct halls, she could feel the tension tightening around her like a noose. She couldn't allow herself to be intimidated. She had a job to do, and she intended to do it well. But she also knew that she had to be prepared for anything. She had already experienced the hostility that some of her new colleagues harbored, and she wasn't naive enough to think that things would settle down on their own. As she walked toward the break room, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Captain Williams. Need to meet. Urgent. Rachel's brow furrowed. She quickly turned on her heel and headed toward his office, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, Williams was already standing outside his office, talking to Sergeant Davis. Both men looked concerned, their faces grim. As Rachel approached, Williams motioned for her to join them. "Lieutenant Thomas," Williams said, his tone serious. "We've got a situation developing. Carter's not taking this well. He's refusing to cooperate with the investigation, and he's been stirring up trouble among the other officers." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "What kind of trouble?" Davis spoke on top, his voice low. "He's been rallying some of the younger guys, telling them that you're here to shake things up, make them look bad. They're angry, and they're talking about pushing back." Rachel crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "So they're banding together to resist accountability." "That's exactly what we don't need right now," Williams nodded. "Agreed, but it's getting worse. Carter's been in the locker room all morning, and I just got word that he's refusing to leave. Says he's not going to be pushed around by anyone, especially not by you." Rachel felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "What do you want me to do, Captain?" Williams sighed. "I'd like you to stay clear for now. Let me and Davis handle it. But I thought you should know what's happening. It's a powder keg in there, and Carter's got a few matches to strike." Rachel nodded slowly. "Understood. But if he keeps escalating, I'll need to address it directly. We can't let this go unchecked." Before Williams could respond, a loud commotion erupted from down the hallway, coming from the direction of the locker room. Raised voices echoed through the halls, and Rachel instantly recognized Carter's angry shout. Without another word, she turned and headed in that direction, with Williams and Davis following close behind. As they reached the locker room, Rachel saw several officers gathered outside, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. Some were peeking inside, whispering to each other. She pushed her way through the crowd and stepped inside, her eyes immediately locking onto Carter. He was standing in the middle of the room, his face flushed with rage, his hands balled into fists. Several of the younger officers were standing around him, looking nervous and uncertain. The atmosphere was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. "Carter!" Rachel called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "That's enough. Stand down and come with me." Carter whipped around to face her, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you can just order me around? You think you can walk in here and act like you're in charge of everything?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the metal lockers. Rachel remained calm, but her heart was pounding. She knew this could get out of hand very quickly. "I am in charge, Carter. I'm your superior officer, and I'm telling you to stand down." But Carter wasn't listening. He was too far gone, too consumed by his anger and resentment. "You don't belong here," he yelled, his voice trembling. "You and your high and mighty attitude, thinking you're better than everyone else. You're not welcome here." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "This isn't about me, Carter. It's about your inability to follow orders and show respect. Now stand down, or there will be consequences." Carter's face twisted with rage, and in a split second his hand shot to his holster. "I'm not taking orders from you," he screamed, pulling his gun out and aiming it directly at Rachel. The room went deadly silent, the only sound the quickened breathing of the officers around them. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Davis shouted, stepping forward, but Rachel held up a hand to stop him. Rachel felt a cold wave of fear wash over her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She raised her hand slowly, her eyes never leaving Carter's. "Carter, put the gun down," she said firmly, her voice clear and steady. "You don't want to do this." But Carter's eyes were wild, his hand shaking as he kept the gun trained on her. "I'm done being pushed around by you. I'm done with all of this," he shouted, his voice breaking. Rachel knew she had to de-escalate the situation quickly. She could see the fear and desperation in his eyes. He wasn't thinking straight. "Listen to me, Carter. You're angry. I get that. But pulling that trigger isn't going to solve anything. It's only going to make things worse. For you, for me, for everyone here." Carter's grip on the gun tightened, his knuckles white. "You think you can just come in here and change everything? I've been here for years, and I'm not going to let you ruin everything I've worked for." Rachel took a slow, careful step closer, her hand still raised. "I'm not here to ruin anything, Carter. I'm here to make this place better, for all of us. But this isn't the way to handle it. Put the gun down, and we'll talk. We can figure this out." But Carter wasn't listening. He was breathing heavily, his face a mask of rage and fear. "I said I'm done," he screamed, his finger twitching on the trigger. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the tension in the room like a physical force, pressing down on her. She knew she had only seconds to act. "Carter, I'm giving you an order. Put the gun down now." Suddenly, Carter's expression changed. His eyes widened, and he seemed to snap back to reality, realizing what he was about to do. His hand trembled, the gun wavering. But before he could fully lower it, one of the younger officers nearby panicked and moved to grab his arm. "Stop!" Rachel yelled. But it was too late. Carter jerked his arm away, and in the chaos, the gun went off. A deafening crack filled the room, and everything seemed to freeze. For a split second, Rachel thought she had been hit, but then she realized she was still standing, still breathing. The bullet had hit the wall behind her, missing her by mere inches. The room erupted into chaos. Several officers rushed forward, tackling Carter to the ground and disarming him. Others were shouting, trying to get control of the situation. Rachel stood there, her heart racing, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Get him out of here," she ordered, her voice firm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Put him in a holding cell until we figure this out." As Carter was dragged away, still shouting incoherently, Rachel turned to the other officers. "Everyone back to your posts. This is over." The room began to clear, but Rachel could feel the weight of what had just happened settling over her. She knew this was far from over. The situation had escalated beyond anything she had anticipated, and now there would be serious consequences. Captain Williams and Sergeant Davis approached her, both looking shaken. "Rachel," Williams began, his voice unsteady, "I'm sorry you had to go through that. We'll make sure he faces the full consequences of his actions." Rachel nodded, her face hard. "We'd better. This precinct needs to see that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Not anymore." Davis put a hand on her shoulder. "You handled that well, Lieutenant. I'm just glad no one got hurt." Rachel let out a long breath, her adrenaline finally starting to ebb. "So am I. But we've got a lot of work to do, and this is just the beginning. As they walked back towards William's office, Rachel knew she had made some enemies today. But she also knew she had made a stand for justice, for accountability, for change, and she was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. The precinct was in chaos. The sound of Officer Carter's gunshot still echoed in the minds of everyone present, leaving an indelible mark on the day. Rachel Thomas stood in the center of the locker room, her heart pounding, her mind sharp. The officers who had just subdued Carter were now dragging him out, his face a mask of anger and confusion. The room buzzed with tension as officers exchanged shocked glances and whispered among themselves. It was clear that the incident had rattled everyone, and the shockwaves were only just beginning. Rachel took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the entire precinct, the culture that had allowed someone like Carter to feel emboldened enough to pull a gun on his superior officer. The gravity of the situation was setting in, and she knew that she had to act swiftly to contain it. Captain Williams entered the locker room, flanked by two senior officers. His face was pale, his jaw set in a grim line. He glanced around, taking in the scene, and his eyes locked onto Rachel. "Lieutenant Thomas," he said, his voice barely masking the stress, "I need you in my office, now." Rachel nodded, keeping her composure. She turned to Sergeant Davis, who was still watching Carter being taken away. "Davis, make sure he's secured, and get a medical check on him. I want a full report by the end of the day," she ordered. "Yes, ma'am," Davis replied, already moving to carry out her instructions. Rachel followed Williams back to his office, her mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. As she walked through the precinct, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She didn't flinch. She kept her head high, her stride purposeful. She was the lieutenant here, and she needed to show strength, even in the face of this chaos. Inside Williams's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Williams closed the door behind them and immediately turned to face her. "Rachel, what the hell just happened back there?" he demanded, his voice barely controlled. Rachel met his gaze, her own eyes hard with resolve. "What happened is that an officer, fueled by prejudice and unchecked anger, pulled a gun on me, and it nearly turned deadly," she said, her tone unwavering. Williams ran a hand over his face, clearly overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. "This is going to blow up in our faces, Lieutenant. The press is already all over the video from the parking lot. Now, it's only a matter of time before they're banging on our doors, demanding answers." Rachel nodded. "Good. Let them demand answers. This precinct has been festering with this kind of behavior for too long. If we don't address it now, it's only going to get worse." Williams leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I'm with you, Rachel. But we have to be smart about this. An internal investigation is mandatory, and we'll cooperate fully. But we also need to control the narrative. We can't afford for this to spiral out of control." Rachel crossed her arms, her expression stern. "What's the plan, then?" "We're going to start with a press conference," Williams said. "We need to get out in front of this. Make it clear that we're taking this incident seriously, and that there will be accountability. I want you to be there, alongside me. You need to speak directly to the public. They need to hear from you." Rachel considered this for a moment. She knew that going public would mean putting herself even more in the spotlight. But she also knew it was the right thing to do. "I'll be there. But I want to make sure that this isn't just lip service. There needs to be real action behind our words." Williams nodded. "Agreed. Carter will be suspended indefinitely, pending the outcome of the investigation. And we're going to implement new training protocols focused on de-escalation and bias. This incident is proof that we need it." Rachel felt a surge of determination. "We should also bring in an external agency to conduct an independent review. We need to show that we're serious about transparency." Williams hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "All right, I'll make the call, but I want you to be prepared for the backlash. Not everyone here is going to be happy about that." Rachel knew he was right. She could already see the lines being drawn, the camps forming, but she also knew that change wasn't easy. It never was. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's do this." The press conference was scheduled for that afternoon. The precinct's lobby was packed with reporters, their cameras and microphones at the ready. The air was thick with anticipation. Rachel stood off to the side, watching as the room filled. She could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her, but she remained composed. This was her chance to speak truth to power, to call out the deep-seated issues that had led to this point. Captain Williams approached her, adjusting his tie nervously. "You ready for this?" he asked. Rachel nodded. More than ready. Williams stepped up to the podium first, clearing his throat as the room quieted down. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. As you all know, there was an incident at this precinct earlier today involving one of our officers. We are here to provide a statement and to answer any questions you may have." The room was silent. Every reporter's eyes trained on him. Williams continued. "First and foremost, let me be clear. The actions of Officer Jack Carter were unacceptable and do not reflect the values of this precinct or the police department as a whole. An internal investigation has been launched, and Officer Carter has been suspended, pending the outcome of that investigation." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and hands shot up with questions. Williams held up a hand. "But before we take questions, I want to introduce Lieutenant Rachel Thomas. She is the new lieutenant of this precinct, and she was the target of this unwarranted aggression. She has a few words she'd like to say." Rachel took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. The flash of cameras nearly blinded her, but she stood tall, her expression resolute. "Thank you, Captain," she began, her voice steady. "As many of you have seen from the footage circulating online, I was the victim of a potentially deadly confrontation with Officer Carter. This was not just an isolated incident. It was a manifestation of a much deeper issue within our police force." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, the tension thick. "I came to this precinct to serve and protect this community, to uphold the law and ensure justice is applied equally to everyone, including within our own ranks. What happened today shows that we still have a long way to go. We need real change, not just talk, not just temporary measures, but systemic change that addresses the root causes of bias, prejudice, and aggression." Rachel could see the reporters hanging on her every word. She knew she was walking a fine line, but she wasn't going to back down. "That is why I am calling for an independent, external investigation into this precinct's practices and culture. We need transparency, and we need accountability. Not just for the public's trust, but for the integrity of every officer who wears this badge and serves this community." There was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted into questions. Rachel held up a hand. "I'll take questions now," she said, her voice firm. "But know this, I am committed to seeing this through. We owe it to ourselves and to the people we serve." The aftermath of the press conference was intense. The media response was swift, with headlines ranging from support for Rachel's stance to criticism of the precinct's handling of the situation. Within hours, news outlets were running segments on the culture of policing, bias training, and the need for reform. Rachel's phone buzzed constantly with messages, some supportive, others less so. Back in the precinct, things were even more tense. Rachel could feel the divide growing deeper. Some officers resented her for bringing in an external review, while others quietly thanked her for standing up. She knew she had allies, but she also knew that she was in for a long battle. Sergeant Davis approached her later that day, his expression grim. "Lieutenant, we've got a problem," he said. "A few of the officers are talking about walking out, saying they won't work under you if this investigation goes forward." Rachel nodded. She had expected this. Let them, she said. If they're not willing to be part of a better, more accountable force, then they don't belong here. Davis sighed. I'm with you, Rachel. But it's going to get ugly. Rachel met his gaze. I know, but I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to do what's right. Later that evening, after most of the reporters had left and the precinct had quieted down, Rachel sat in her office, staring at the stack of reports and paperwork piling up on her desk. She knew she was fighting an uphill battle, but she wasn't afraid of the challenge. She had faced tougher odds before, and she knew that change never came easy. There was a knock on her door, and Captain Williams entered, looking exhausted. Long day, he said, taking a seat across from her. Rachel nodded. Yeah. And it's only going to get longer. Williams rubbed his eyes. You sure you're ready for this, Rachel? This isn't going to end anytime soon. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression resolute. I'm sure, Captain. I've spent my entire career fighting for what's right. I'm not stopping now. Williams gave her a tired smile. All right then. Let's get to work. As they started to go over the plans for the investigation and the new protocols they would implement, Rachel felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the road ahead would be tough, but she was ready. She was ready to stand up, to fight, and to lead the charge for real change. And she knew she wouldn't be doing it alone. The precinct was watching, the public was watching, and Rachel Thomas was more determined than ever to show them what true leadership looked like. The following morning, the precinct was a hive of activity. The events of the previous day had left everyone on edge, and the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The press conference had ignited a firestorm in the media, and the footage of Officer Carter pulling a gun on Lieutenant Rachel Thomas was being replayed on news stations across the country. The precinct was under a microscope, and everyone knew it. Rachel arrived early, her face set with determination. She could feel the weight of the scrutiny bearing down on her, but she also knew that this was her chance to push for real, meaningful change. She had spent the night preparing, going over her notes, and the new protocols she wanted to implement. There was no room for hesitation. This was a critical moment. As she walked through the precinct, she could see the divide among her colleagues becoming more pronounced. Some officers nodded at her in support, while others turned away, their expressions hard and resentful. She knew that the pressure was getting to them. The independent investigation she had called for was underway, and it had sent shockwaves through the department. The culture that had allowed Carter's behavior to go unchecked was finally being exposed, and not everyone was happy about it. Rachel made her way to the briefing room, where Captain Williams and Sergeant Davis were already waiting. Several officers were seated around the large conference table, and she could sense their unease. The senior officers had a mix of apprehension and concern on their faces. The room fell silent as she entered, all eyes on her. Good morning, everyone, she began, taking her place at the head of the table. I know there's a lot going on right now, and I know some of you are feeling the pressure. But let's be clear, what happened yesterday was a wake-up call. We're not just dealing with an isolated incident. We're dealing with a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. A few officers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Rachel continued. I want to assure you that this investigation isn't about pointing fingers or punishing people without cause. It's about ensuring that we're all held to the same standard of accountability, that we're all serving this community with the integrity it deserves. Captain Williams nodded in agreement. That's right. We're here to work together to make this precinct a better place. But we can't do that if we're divided. We need to come together and support each other through this process. One of the younger officers, Martinez, spoke up hesitantly. Lieutenant, I hear what you're saying, but a lot of us are feeling like we're under attack. It's hard to focus on doing our jobs when we're worried about what's going to happen next. Rachel understood the concern. I get that, Martinez. And I want you to know that I'm committed to making sure this process is fair and transparent. But we have to be willing to face the issues head-on. Ignoring them won't make them go away. Another officer, O'Connor, one of Carter's closest allies, crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his expression defiant. And what about Carter? You're just going to throw him under the bus because he had a moment? You're going to ruin his career over one mistake? Rachel kept her tone measured. What Carter did wasn't a moment, O'Connor. It was a serious breach of protocol and an act of aggression that could have cost someone their life. We can't dismiss that as just a mistake. There are consequences to actions like that. O'Connor's face reddened with anger. So that's it? We're all just supposed to be afraid to do our jobs now? Afraid that we're going to be the next one hung out to dry? Rachel met his gaze steadily. No one is hanging anyone out to dry, O'Connor. But if you can't handle being held accountable for your actions, then maybe you need to think about whether you're in the right line of work. The room was silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Then Davis cleared his throat, stepping in to ease the situation. Look, we all know this isn't easy, but we need to stick together. The investigation is going to run its course, and we need to let it. In the meantime, we've got a job to do. Rachel nodded. Exactly. We're all here to serve this community. Let's not lose sight of that. As the briefing continued, Rachel could see that while some officers were coming around, others were digging in their heels. She knew it was going to take time to change the culture here, but she was committed to seeing it through. Later that day, Rachel sat in her office, reviewing the initial findings from the independent investigators. They were thorough, interviewing officers, reviewing past incident reports, and looking into the overall culture of the precinct. It was clear that there were deep-seated issues that needed to be addressed. As she read through the report, she felt a mixture of vindication and frustration. This was exactly what she had expected, but it was still disheartening to see it laid out in black and white. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was a message from Captain Williams. "Come to my office. We have a situation." Rachel's heart sank slightly, but she got up and made her way to his office. When she arrived, she found Williams and Davis already there, looking tense. "What's going on?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Williams sighed, rubbing his temples. "We've got a problem. A group of officers, about a dozen, are threatening to walk out. They're saying they won't work under your command if this investigation continues." Rachel felt a wave of frustration wash over her. So what? They're trying to hold us hostage now? If they don't get their way, they're going to leave? Davis nodded grimly. Pretty much. They're saying it's a matter of trust, that they don't feel like you have their backs.